The prison yard is split into individual steel cages, one man per cage, arm's length apart, separated only by a chain link fence. It's the only version of Fresh Air Red Onion State Prison allows its most dangerous inmates. Aaron Cooper stands in his cage, 26 years old, 34 years left on his sentence. He didn't come here to make friends. He came here to survive 1 hour outside a cell. In the cage beside him is a man who's already killed twice. Cooper doesn't know that yet. Nobody warned him. The man leans toward the fence, says he's got something to show him, a necklace, something religious. Cooper leans in too. Curiosity, boredom, maybe kindness. People do that. They lean in. That's the mistake. Hands come through the chain link. Fast. Locked around his throat before he can pull back. The fence that was supposed to keep them apart becomes the weapon that kills him. Guards are close. Cameras are running. None of it matters. By the time anyone reaches the cage, Aaron Cooper is dead, strangled through a fence, in a supermax prison, in broad daylight. This isn't the first man this killer has murdered inside these walls. It isn't even his second. And here's the part that should terrify you. He wanted to get caught. Because for this man, killing again wasn't about escape. It wasn't about revenge. It was a message to the state of Virginia, one he'd already sent once before, and was about to send again. He wanted the death penalty, and he was willing to kill as many times as it took to get it. His name is Robert Gleason, and the murder you just watched wasn't an accident, a fight gone wrong, or an act of self-defense. It was planned. 3 years earlier, Gleason was already serving life without parole for a killing outside these walls. That sentence should have been the end of his story. Instead, it was the beginning of something far worse. Behind bars, Gleason didn't stop killing. He escalated. In 2009, he strangled his own cellmate. Not out of rage, out of strategy. He wanted the state to notice him. He wanted a courtroom, a headline, a death sentence. When Virginia refused to give him what he asked for, he made a promise. He would kill again and again, until someone finally agreed to end his life. Aaron Cooper wasn't the first person to pay for that promise. He was the second. So the real question isn't who killed Aaron Cooper. It's why a man would murder strangers just to guarantee his own execution, and how the system let it happen twice. If a story like this makes you question how justice actually works, hit subscribe right now, because this channel breaks down the cases the headlines never fully explain. And before we go further into Robert Gleason's past, drop a comment. Do you think a killer like this deserves the death penalty he was begging for, or does that make the system just as complicit? Let's get into who he really was. Before he was a name attached to a death sentence, Robert Charles Gleason Jr. was just a man from Lowell, Massachusetts, born in 1970. There's no dramatic origin story here, no early warning signs splashed across public record. He grew up largely out of the spotlight, and by the time he resurfaces in any documented history, he's already an adult, living a very different kind of life in Virginia. Gleason built a reputation as a skilled tattoo artist, the kind of trade that requires patience, precision, and an eye for detail. It's an odd contrast to what he'd eventually become known for, but the ink wasn't his only affiliation. Gleason ran with the Hells Angels, a motorcycle gang with deep ties to organized crime across the country. And through those connections, he found his way into something far more dangerous than tattoos, a methamphetamine trafficking operation. This wasn't small-time dealing. Federal investigators were already circling the operation, building a case, looking for the weak links that would bring the whole thing down. In that world, a weak link doesn't just mean prison time for one person. It means the collapse of an entire network. Gleason had one prior brush with lethal violence long before any of this. Back in 1974, he shot and killed a man who broke into his store. He was acquitted. The courts ruled it self-defense, and Gleason walked away from that killing entirely. That's the man we're dealing with going into 2007. A tattoo artist, a biker, a meth trafficker, someone comfortable around danger, and someone who had already taken a life once before without facing consequences for it. He believed in a code, or at least he claimed to. Later, when talking about the people he killed, Gleason would say he never hurt anyone innocent, only people in the same lifestyle as him, criminals, associates, people who understood, in his words, that these things can happen. It's a chilling justification, and one that tells you exactly how Gleason saw himself. Not as a random killer, but as someone operating by his own twisted set of rules. Inside a world most people never see. But in 2007, that world was about to close in on him. Someone connected to his drug operation was talking to federal agents, and Gleason decided there was only one way to make sure that conversation didn't continue. May 8, 2007. A wooded stretch of Amherst County, Virginia. Michael Kent Jamerson, a 54-year-old truck driver, has no idea this day will be his last. Jamerson wasn't a criminal. He wasn't part of the meth operation, wasn't running drugs, wasn't laundering money. His only connection to Robert Gleason's world was through his son, who was reportedly cooperating with federal investigators building a case against the trafficking ring Gleason belonged to. That single fact made Jamerson a liability, and in Gleason's mind, liabilities didn't get warnings. They got eliminated. Gleason lured Jamerson out to that wooded area under circumstances that remain partly unclear even today. What isn't unclear is what happened once they were alone. According to Gleason's own account, given years later during a sentencing hearing, he reached for the pistol on Jamerson's belt, Jamerson's own weapon, and turned it against him. He told Jamerson to get right with God. Then he pulled the trigger. There was no struggle captured on camera, no witness who saw the moment itself, no immediate confession. For a while, it looked like Gleason might walk away from this, the same way he walked away from the 1974 shooting. Clean, untouched, back to his life, like nothing happened. But this time was different. Investigators had relatively little direct physical evidence tying Gleason to the scene. And yet, something about the case built enough pressure that by 2008, Gleason made a decision nobody expected from a man who'd once escaped consequences entirely. He pleaded guilty. No trial. No drawn-out fight for innocence. Gleason stood in front of a Virginia court and admitted he killed Michael Jamerson to protect his drug operation from a witness he saw as a threat. The sentence? Life in prison, without the possibility of parole. For most people, that would be the end of the story. A guilty plea, a life sentence, a name that fades from headlines within a year. Case closed. Justice served, in whatever imperfect way the system manages it. But Robert Gleason wasn't most people. And life without parole didn't mean what everyone assumed it would mean. Not for him, and not for the people who would eventually share a cell block with him. Because somewhere between his guilty plea and his arrival at Wallens Ridge State Prison, Gleason had already started thinking about what came next. He wasn't interested in serving out a quiet life sentence. He wasn't interested in appeals or rehabilitation programs or making peace with decades behind bars. He wanted something the state of Virginia hadn't given him, a death sentence. And if the courts wouldn't hand him one for killing Michael Jamerson, Gleason had already decided he'd find another way to force their hand. He just needed a cellmate. If you're already unsettled by what Gleason was planning next, imagine how the people locked in that prison with him felt. Smash that like button if you want to see how far he was willing to go, and subscribe so you don't miss how this story ends. Now let's talk about the man who became his next target. His own cellmate, Harvey Watson. Wallens Ridge State Prison. A high-security facility in Big Stone Gap, Virginia, built to hold men the state considers too dangerous for general population. This is where Robert Gleason landed after his guilty plea, and this is where he was assigned a cellmate, 63-year-old Harvey Gray Watson. Watson wasn't a hardened criminal in the way Gleason was. He was severely mentally ill, serving a 100-year sentence for a 1983 shooting spree that had killed one person and injured 3 others. A tragedy rooted in a mental health crisis decades earlier, not calculated violence. By the time he shared a cell with Gleason, Watson was an old man, fragile, and clearly struggling. Gleason complained, repeatedly. He told prison officials that Watson's behavior was becoming impossible to live with, and he asked, more than once, to be moved to a different cell. The Department of Corrections said no. Nobody could have known what that refusal would cost. May 8, 2009. Exactly 2 years to the day since Gleason murdered Michael Jamerson in that Amherst County forest. The date wasn't a coincidence. Gleason chose it. He told Watson he had an escape plan. All Watson had to do was let his hands be tied. Trust him, play along, and freedom was possible. Watson agreed. That trust was the last mistake he ever made. Gleason hogtied him, beat him, strangled him, and in a detail that still turns stomachs more than a decade later, he stuffed a urine-soaked sponge into Watson's mouth, not out of necessity, but as a final act of humiliation. Then Gleason waited. For roughly 15 hours, Robert Gleason shared that cell with a dead body. He didn't panic. He didn't try to hide what he'd done or dispose of evidence. He simply waited for prison staff to discover it on their own. Because this was never about escaping. This was never about rage or revenge or even really about Harvey Watson at all. This was a message, deliberately timed, deliberately brutal, aimed directly at the state of Virginia. Gleason wanted everyone to understand something. Life without parole meant nothing to him. He wasn't afraid of dying. If anything, he wanted to die. And he'd just proven he was willing to take another human life to make that happen. When he was finally moved, transferred to Red Onion State Prison, one of the most secure facilities in the country, reserved for the worst of the worst, Gleason didn't go quietly. He used every courtroom appearance, every media opportunity available to him, to say the same thing over and over: "Give me the death penalty, or I will kill again." It wasn't a threat buried in a private confession. It was public, on record, impossible to misunderstand, and the state of Virginia didn't act on it. Harvey Watson's murder should have been the moment everyone realized how dangerous Gleason truly was. Dangerous enough that even a maximum security cell wasn't containing him. Instead, the system moved him, isolated him further, and effectively waited to see what he'd do next. They wouldn't have to wait long. After Harvey Watson's death, Robert Gleason didn't hide his intentions. He announced them, in courtroom appearances, in interviews, in every setting where someone with a microphone or a notepad would listen. Gleason repeated the same warning: give him the death penalty, or he would kill again. This wasn't a whisper behind closed doors. It was a public promise, made on record, to anyone who would take it seriously. And here's the part that should unsettle you most. Almost nobody did. Prison officials, court officers, the state itself. A man serving life without parole had just murdered his own cellmate in cold blood, using a method he clearly planned in advance, on a date he clearly chose with intent. And yet the system's response was to move him to a different facility and continue business as usual. Would you have believed him? If a man told you plainly, "I will kill again unless you stop me," would you take that as a bluff or a certainty? That's the question Virginia's prison system had to answer in 2009. And their answer, whether intentional or not, was that Gleason's words weren't credible enough to change how he was managed. Maybe officials assumed the isolation of Red Onion State Prison, one of the most secure facilities in the country, would be enough to contain him. Maybe they believed no opportunity would present itself. Maybe they simply didn't have a system built to handle an inmate who wanted to die and was willing to take others down with him. Whatever the reasoning, it left one fact unchanged. Robert Gleason had told the truth about who he was, and he was still surrounded by other human beings. It wouldn't take long before he proved his warning wasn't empty. Red Onion State Prison, July 28, 2010. You already know how this ends. You watched it happen in the opening seconds of this video. Now let's understand how Robert Gleason actually pulled it off, and why the design of the prison itself became the weapon he used. Red Onion houses inmates in individual outdoor recreation cages, spaced apart, separated by chain-link fencing. The system exists specifically to prevent contact between dangerous prisoners. On paper, it should have made a murder like this impossible. Gleason found the gap anyway. Aaron Cooper, 26 years old, was serving a 34-year sentence for carjacking and robbery. A serious record, but nothing that suggested he was a target for anything beyond ordinary prison tension. He wasn't an enemy of Gleason's. He wasn't a threat. He was, as far as anyone can tell, simply the person assigned to the cage next to him that day. Gleason struck up a conversation through the fence, told Cooper he had a religious necklace to show him. It's a small, almost gentle detail, the kind of interaction that happens constantly in prison yards, inmates passing time, showing off small possessions, making conversation to survive the monotony. Cooper leaned toward the fence to look. Gleason's hands came through the links and locked around his throat. There was no room to pull away, no way for guards stationed nearby to intervene before it was too late. The barrier meant to keep these two men from ever touching became the exact mechanism Gleason used to kill him. When it was over, Gleason didn't resist, didn't run, didn't deny anything. He'd done exactly what he said he would do. This was murder number 3. 2 of them committed while he was already serving a life sentence, both timed and executed with clear premeditation. Both carried out despite Gleason openly telling the state, in advance, that this was coming. Reflecting on his own logic afterward, Gleason offered a chilling kind of justification. I ain't saying I'm a better person for killing criminals, but I've never killed innocent. I killed people that's in the same lifestyle as me, and they know, hey, these things can happen. It's a statement that reveals exactly how Gleason saw his victims, not as human beings with families and futures, but as acceptable losses in a code only he believed in. Aaron Cooper's death finally forced the state's hand. The question was no longer whether Robert Gleason was dangerous. The question was what Virginia would finally do about it. 2 prison murders, 2 victims who never had to die, and a killer who had warned everyone, in advance, exactly what he was planning to do. By the time Aaron Cooper's death was confirmed, there was no real mystery left to solve. Corrections staff had access to the cages, the layout of the yard, and Gleason himself, who never once denied what he'd done. The investigation wasn't about finding a suspect. It was about finalizing what everyone already knew. Gleason pleaded guilty. Again, just as he had for Michael Jamerson, just as he had for Harvey Watson, he stood in front of the court and admitted responsibility without a fight. But what happened next set his case apart from almost any other in modern American criminal history. Gleason didn't just accept his sentence. He actively worked to remove every safeguard the legal system offers condemned inmates. He waived his right to appeal. He refused offers of legal assistance meant to slow down or challenge his execution. He declined to file a clemency petition, the standard final request most death row inmates use to ask for their sentence to be reduced. He told the court, plainly, that he wanted his execution to proceed exactly as scheduled. No delays, no last-minute legal maneuvering, no mercy requested. Then Governor Bob McDonnell still reviewed the case despite the absence of any clemency request, a step taken to ensure due process was followed even when the inmate himself wasn't asking for it. After that review, McDonnell made his decision. The execution would move forward. In capital punishment terminology, inmates like Gleason are known as volunteers, men and women who actively pursue their own execution rather than fight it. It's a rare classification, and an uncomfortable one, because it forces a difficult question onto the state carrying out the sentence. Was Virginia handing down justice for 3 murders? Or was it granting Robert Gleason exactly what he wanted, on his own terms, using the very system meant to hold him accountable? There's no clean answer. Gleason had killed 3 people specifically to engineer this outcome, and in the end, the state gave it to him. What's left is the execution itself, the final hours of a man who spent years fighting to die, and who was about to get his wish in the most literal, historic way possible. January 16, 2013, Greensville Correctional Center, Girard, Virginia. After years of demanding it, Robert Gleason was finally getting what he'd killed 3 people to obtain. Virginia law gave death row inmates a choice between lethal injection and the electric chair. Most choose injection. It's the default method, the one associated with less physical violence. Gleason chose the electric chair. It's worth sitting with that decision for a moment. This wasn't a man trying to minimize suffering or seek a quiet end. Even in his final choice, Gleason picked the more brutal, more historic method available to him. A fitting final statement from someone who spent years using violence to force the state's hand. His last meal request was kept private, at his own wish. No details, no final indulgence shared with the public. It was one of the only things about his death Gleason chose to keep for himself. At 9:08 p.m., Robert Gleason was executed by electric chair. He was the first person executed in the United States that year. His final words were delivered with the same defiance that had defined his entire time behind bars. Well, I hope Percy ain't going to forget to wet the sponge, put me on the highway to Jackson, and call my Irish buddies. Pogue mo thoin, God bless. That phrase, pogue mo thoin, is Irish. It translates to, kiss my arse. Even in his last seconds, Gleason wasn't asking for forgiveness or reflecting on the lives he'd taken. He was performing, right up until the current ran through him. His execution marked the first use of the electric chair in the United States since March 2010, nearly 3 years earlier. For a method of execution many assumed was fading into history, Gleason's death briefly brought it back into the national conversation. 3 murders, years of public warnings, a guilty plea with no fight attached, a refusal of appeals, of legal help, of clemency, and finally, a request granted exactly as he'd demanded it. Robert Gleason got what he wanted. The only question that remained was what his case would mean for everyone left behind, the families of his victims, the prison system that failed to stop him twice, and a state now forced to reckon with the fact that a man who wanted to die had used the death penalty as a weapon. If this case left you questioning what justice really means, you're not alone, and this is exactly why this channel exists. Comment below, do you think Virginia made the right call by giving Gleason what he wanted, or should the system have refused him on principle? If you want more cases that force you to think, not just watch, subscribe now before we get into what Gleason's story means today. Nearly a decade after Robert Gleason's execution, his case resurfaced in a debate nobody expected it to influence. In 2021, Virginia lawmakers moved to abolish the death penalty entirely. During that debate, supporters of capital punishment pointed directly to Gleason's story as evidence that execution had done something life without parole couldn't. It stopped him from killing again. Twice, Gleason had murdered while already serving a life sentence. A third time was only prevented because the state finally carried out what he'd been demanding for years. Despite that argument, Virginia abolished capital punishment on March 24, 2021. Robert Gleason became, permanently, the last person ever executed in the Commonwealth, and the last person executed there by electric chair. His death also stood as the final electrocution carried out anywhere in the United States for nearly 6 years, until Tennessee executed another inmate by the same method in 2018. So what do we actually take from a story like this? It's not a lesson about trusting your instincts or avoiding a dangerous stranger. It's something harder to sit with. Robert Gleason exposed a genuine blind spot in how prisons manage inmates who've already lost everything they have to lose. A life sentence assumes the worst outcome has already happened. Gleason proved that assumption wrong twice, with 2 men who never should have died. The real question this case leaves behind isn't about Gleason at all. It's about the system around him, and whether it's built to recognize danger even when that danger tells you exactly what it plans to do next. Harvey Watson and Aaron Cooper weren't victims of a mystery. They were victims of a warning nobody acted on. Robert Gleason spent years demanding the state take his life, and in the end, that's exactly what happened. But Harvey Watson and Aaron Cooper didn't get a choice. Their deaths are the part of this story that should stay with you long after this video ends. If this case made you think differently about justice, prisons, or the system meant to protect people from men like Gleason, let us know in the comments. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this story. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next case that forces you to ask hard questions instead of easy ones.